Sirens never warned Albert that his Tuesday coffee would turn into a standoff. Two badge-heavy patrolmen thought they found an easy mark in a quiet diner booth, a silent, unassuming man minding his own business. They crossed the line, laughed in his face, and slapped on the cuffs, completely unaware they had just poked a sleeping leviathan. What these arrogant rookies didn't know was that one silent SOS from this man's watch was about to bring the full, unbridled wrath of the United States military crashing down on their heads. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon sunlight that pierced the grimy windows of the Pine Ridge Diner. It was the kind of forgotten roadside establishment that smelled perpetually of old fryer grease, stale coffee, and floor wax. Albert Peterson sat in booth 4, his back to the wall, facing the entrance. It was a habit ingrained over 3 decades of operating in the world's most hostile environments, a reflex he couldn't switch off even in retirement. Albert was a man who blended in by design. He wore a faded olive-drab Henley shirt that stretched across a broad, muscular chest, worn-in denim jeans, and heavy boots. His face was a map of quiet endurance, framed by close-cropped graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His dark skin bore a few subtle, pale scars that spoke of a life lived dangerously, but his eyes were the most striking feature, deep, calm, and unnervingly still. He was reading a battered paperback copy of Meditations, quietly sipping black coffee, completely at peace with the world. That peace shattered when the diner door swung open, the bell above it letting out a harsh, jangling shriek. In walked Officers Bradley Norton and Kevin Rust. Even before they spoke, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. The few regular patrons, a pair of truckers, an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie, and the tired waitress behind the counter, stiffened. Norton and Rust belonged to the Pine Ridge Police Department, a small, underfunded outfit notorious for its heavy-handed tactics. Norton was a heavily built man with a ruddy complexion, a tight buzz cut, and a utility belt that squeaked loudly with every swaggering step. Rust, his partner, was leaner, younger, and possessed the nervous, eager energy of a stray dog looking for a fight to prove its worth. They walked up to the counter, grabbed 2 coffees without asking or paying, and turned to survey the room. Norton's eyes swept past the truckers and the old couple, finally landing on Albert in booth 4. Albert didn't look up from his book. He turned a page, his breathing slow and even. To a man like Norton, who demanded immediate deference from everyone he encountered, Albert's lack of reaction was a direct insult. Furthermore, Albert was a black stranger in a town that Norton treated as his personal fiefdom. The equation in Norton's head was simple: an unrecognized face, minding his own business, not shrinking in the presence of a badge, equaled a target. Norton nudged Rust. "Check out the VIP over there," he muttered, loud enough for the diner to hear. Rust smirked, adjusting his duty belt. "Looks lost. Maybe he can't read the signs. This is a local spot." The 2 officers closed the distance to booth 4, their heavy boots thudding against the checkered linoleum floor. They stopped right beside Albert's table, invading his personal space, intentionally casting a shadow over his book. Albert finished reading the paragraph, calmly placed a receipt to mark his page, and closed the book. He took a slow sip of his coffee, set the mug down, and finally looked up. "Can I help you, officers?" Albert asked. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, perfectly steady, devoid of the tremor of fear that Norton was used to hearing. "Who are you?" Norton demanded, resting his hand casually on the butt of his taser. "I haven't seen you around Pine Ridge." "I'm passing through," Albert replied simply. He didn't elaborate. He didn't feel the need to explain that he had just visited the grave of a fallen comrade a few towns over, or that he was enjoying a rare cross-country road trip to clear his head. He owed these men nothing but basic courtesy. Passing through, Rust echoed mockingly. Where from? Where to? From the East Coast. Heading west, Albert said, his eyes locking onto Norton's. The eye contact was held just a fraction of a second too long for Norton's comfort. It wasn't defiant, it was analytical. Albert was sizing them up, noting the slight tremor in Rust's hand, the asymmetrical wear on Norton's holster, the sweat beading on their foreheads despite the air-conditioned diner. Let's see some ID, Norton snapped, his face flushing a deeper shade of red. The diner was dead silent now. The waitress, Brenner, watched with wide, anxious eyes, a damp rag frozen in her hands. Am I suspected of committing a crime, officer? Albert asked politely. He knew the law. He knew the parameters of a Terry stop, the requirements for reasonable, articulable suspicion, and the Fourth Amendment inside and out. You're suspected of being a smart mouth in my town, Norton growled, leaning over the table, trying to use his bulk to intimidate. I said, let's see the ID now, before things get complicated for you. Albert sighed softly. He didn't want a confrontation. He was tired, his joints ached from old shrapnel wounds, and he just wanted to finish his coffee. Slowly, deliberately keeping his hands visible to ensure they couldn't claim he was reaching for a weapon, Albert reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a simple leather wallet, extracted a standard driver's license, and set it on the table. He did not hand his military retired ID, nor the specialized security clearance card tucked behind it. Just a standard civilian license. Norton snatched it up, his eyes scanning the plastic. Albert Peterson, address out of Virginia. Long way from home, Albert. What's a guy like you doing loitering in a diner? Drinking coffee, Albert said flatly, which I paid for. I think you're looking for trouble, Rust chimed in, circling to the other side of the booth, trapping Albert in. I think you look like a guy who fits the description of a string of burglaries we've had in the county. It was a blatant, lazy lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Albert's posture didn't change. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Rust with a gaze so intensely vacant, it made the younger officer take a half step back. I think, Albert said softly, you gentlemen are making a mistake. The only mistake here is your attitude, boy, Norton sneered, tossing the ID back onto the table. It slid off the edge and fell onto the floor. Pick it up, then get up. We're taking this conversation outside. The heavy diner door slammed shut behind them, sealing off the cool air. Outside, the Georgia afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The heat radiating from the pavement was stifling, thick with the smell of melting tar and exhaust from the idling police cruiser. Albert walked out with a measured, deliberate stride. He had left a $5 bill on the table for a $2 coffee, picked up his license from the floor, and stepped out into the blinding light without a word of protest. His mind, trained by decades of psychological warfare and close-quarters combat, was already playing out the next 10 minutes in a hyper-accelerated tactical simulation. He knew exactly what kind of men Norton and Rust were. They were predators of opportunity, cowards who hid behind a tin shield, mistaking municipal authority for absolute power. Over to the car, hands on the hood, Norton barked, unhooking his handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound was meant to be intimidating. To Albert, who had listened to the terrifying, mechanical racking of heavy machine guns in the mountains of Afghanistan, the sound was barely a nuisance. Albert walked to the cruiser. He placed his palms flat on the scorching hot metal of the hood. He spread his legs slightly, assuming the position before they even asked. His compliance was flawless, which only seemed to infuriate the two officers further. They wanted a reaction. They wanted an excuse. Rust stepped in close, forcefully kicking Albert's ankles further apart. "Wider!" he hissed. He began an aggressively rough pat-down, his hand slapping hard against Albert's pockets, moving up his ribs and forcefully yanking the collar of his shirt. "He's clean," Rust muttered, sounding genuinely disappointed. "No weapons, just a phone and a watch." "Empty your pockets! Everything on the hood!" Norton ordered, stepping up right behind Albert, pressing his chest against Albert's back in a clear display of dominance. Albert slowly reached into his pockets. He placed his wallet, his keys, and a heavy, matte black tactical smartwatch on the hood. Norton picked up the watch. It wasn't a standard consumer brand. It was thick, ruggedized, and bore no visible logo. The screen was completely blank. "Fancy toy, probably stolen," Norton muttered, tossing it carelessly back onto the metal. He didn't notice the microscopic, recessed button on the side of the casing, nor did he understand the complex biometric lock that kept the device dormant to anyone but its owner. "I'll ask you one more time," Norton said, leaning into Albert's ear. "What's a guy like you doing in my town?" "I answered your question, Officer Norton," Albert replied, his voice a low rumble. "I'm passing through. I have broken no laws. I have complied with your unconstitutional search. Now, I am asking you respectfully to return my property and allow me to leave." "Unconstitutional?" Rust laughed loudly, a shrill, nervous sound. "Listen to the lawyer here. He thinks he knows his rights." "I do," Albert said. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Norton. The air between them seemed to crackle. "And I strongly advise you to end this interaction right now, for your own sake." It was the wrong thing to say to a tyrant. Norton's face twisted into an ugly snarl. The idea that this man, this quiet, unassuming civilian, was threatening him on his own turf was entirely unacceptable. "Are you threatening a police officer?" Norton roared, grabbing Albert by the back of the neck and slamming his face downward toward the hood. Albert could have stopped it. In a fraction of a second, his trained muscle memory flared. He could have broken Norton's wrist, swept Rust's legs out from under him, and had both men unconscious on the asphalt before the diner patrons could even blink. But Albert didn't move. He allowed his cheek to hit the hot metal of the car hood. He let them feel powerful. He knew the consequences of assaulting a police officer, even a corrupt one. And he knew a much more devastating, legally sound mechanism to handle this situation. "Resisting arrest!" Rust yelled, grabbing Albert's left arm and twisting it painfully behind his back. It was a textbook setup. They were shouting commands to a man who wasn't fighting back, creating an audio record for their body cameras of a struggle that didn't exist. Stop resisting, Norton shouted, pulling Albert's right arm back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Albert's wrists. The ratchets clicked tightly, squeezing the skin, pinching the nerves. They yanked him backward off the hood, spinning him around to face them. Albert's face was completely impassive. He didn't wince. He didn't rub his wrists. He just stared at them with a look of profound, chilling pity. "You're making a catastrophic, tactical error," Albert said quietly. Norton laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Yeah? What are you going to do about it? Call your lawyer. We own the judge in this county, buddy. You're going to sit in a cell until we decide you've learned some manners." "Get him in the back," Rust said, shoving Albert roughly toward the rear door of the cruiser. As Albert stumbled forward, his bound hands brushed against the items on the hood of the car. In one fluid, imperceptible motion, his thumb grazed the heavy, matte black watch. He didn't need to look at it. He knew exactly where the recessed button was. He pressed it twice, held it for 3 seconds, and released it. A microscopic LED on the watch face flashed an invisible infrared sequence. A high-frequency encrypted data packet beamed directly from the device to a secure military satellite orbiting in the exosphere. Code: Vanguard-Actual. Status: Distress/Hostile Detainment. Coordinates: Pinned. Albert let them push him into the cramped, plastic-lined back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, locking him in. The heat inside the vehicle was oppressive. But Albert simply leaned back against the hard plastic, closed his eyes, and began to count the seconds. He had tried to warn them. Now it was out of his hands. 80 miles away, the atmosphere inside the Joint Command Center of the Atlantic Amphibious Task Force was usually a low hum of controlled chaos. Rows of analysts sat before glowing monitors, tracking naval assets, global troop movements, and regional security grids. At exactly 2:14 p.m., a Priority 1 alarm shattered the routine. It wasn't a blaring siren, but a sharp, persistent electronic pulse that instantly muted all other communications in the room. On the massive primary display screen at the front of the command center, a digital map of the eastern seaboard vanished, replaced by a flashing crimson grid. A single pulsing golden icon appeared just outside the tiny municipal boundary of Pine Ridge, Georgia. Above the icon, stark white letters spelled out a designation that made the blood run cold in the veins of every senior officer in the room. Vanguard Actual. "Report!" barked a voice from the elevated command catwalk. Admiral Thomas Croft stepped up to the railing, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the crimson screen. Croft was a legend in his own right, a battle-hardened Navy commander who currently oversaw a massive Joint Forces integration project. He was a man who commanded fleets, dictated theater-wide strategy, and didn't flinch when entire nations postured for war. But seeing that specific call sign on the distress board made his stomach drop. "Sir," the lead communications officer called out, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "We just received an automated distress signal. Priority black. Encryption matches the Vanguard protocol." "Are you certain?" Admiral Croft demanded, already moving toward the stairs, his boots ringing loudly on the metal grating. "Verify the biometric handshake." "Handshake verified, Admiral," the officer replied, his voice tight with adrenaline. "It's him. The signal indicates hostile detainment. GPS coordinates place him in the parking lot of a civilian diner in Pine Ridge. No friendly assets in the immediate vicinity." Croft reached the main floor. He knew exactly who Vanguard Actual was. Albert Peterson wasn't just a retired operator. He was the architect of modern asymmetric warfare protocols, a man who had pulled Croft's own son out of a burning Black Hawk in Mogadishu 20 years ago. Peterson was currently operating as a highly classified civilian consultant for the Joint Chiefs, carrying a security clearance so high it technically didn't exist on standard military rosters. If Peterson had triggered a priority black distress beacon on domestic soil, it meant the situation was dire, and conventional law enforcement was either compromised or the direct threat. "Get me the base commander of Camp Lejeune and connect me to the Quick Reaction Force commander at the airfield," Croft ordered, his voice cold and precise. "I want birds in the air 5 minutes ago." "Admiral, Pine Ridge is a civilian jurisdiction," a legal aide interjected hesitantly from the side. If local law enforcement has him, they have unlawfully detained a Tier 1 national security asset carrying classified intelligence in his head that enemies of this nation would pay billions for," Croft snapped, cutting the aide off completely. "We treat this as a hostile domestic extraction. I am taking operational control under the Patriot Act, Section 7, Exigent Circumstances." Croft turned to the tactical officer. "Deploy the QRF, full battle rattle, 50 Marines. I want 2 CV-22 Ospreys and a ground convoy of armored Joint Light Tactical Vehicles. We are establishing a perimeter, securing the package, and detaining any hostile elements holding him." "Rules of engagement, sir?" the tactical officer asked. "Show of overwhelming force. Do not fire unless fired upon. But you make damn sure whoever is holding Vanguard understands that the wrath of God has just arrived," Croft said. He grabbed his cover from a nearby desk and settled it onto his head. "I'm going with them. Have my command bird spooled up." Back in Pine Ridge, Officers Norton and Rust were entirely oblivious to the apocalyptic storm gathering just over the horizon. They were cruising slowly down Highway 9, the diner falling behind them in the rearview mirror. The air conditioning in the front of the cruiser blasted on high, while Albert baked in the stifling heat of the back seat. "I tell you, Kev, guys like that think they can just waltz in and do whatever they want," Norton boasted, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Did you see the look on his face when I cuffed him? Thought he was so tough." Rust chuckled, looking back through the plexiglass partition at Albert, who was staring blankly out the window. "What are we going to charge him with, Brad? Resisting is good, but we didn't really find anything on him." "We'll find something," Norton said, waving a hand dismissively. "Vagrancy. Disturbing the peace. We'll dump him in holding, let him sweat for 48 hours without a phone call. By Monday, he'll be begging to plead guilty to whatever we write down, just to get out of town." Norton reached for the radio mic on the dashboard. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. We've got a 1015 in custody, transporting back to the house." The radio crackled with static for a moment. Then the dispatcher's voice came through, but it didn't sound like the usual bored, drawling tone of the station manager. It sounded frantic. "Unit 4, Norton, where are you right now?" "Highway 9, headed north, about 2 miles out from the station." "Why? What's going on?" Norton asked, frowning. "Norton, you need to pull over," the dispatcher said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just got a call from the state police and the governor's office. And I don't even know, Brad. Federal agencies. They're locking down the county airspace." "What are you talking about, Brenner?" Norton scoffed. "Airspace? We're in the middle of nowhere." "Listen to me," the dispatcher yelled through the radio, the panic fully breaking through. "I'm looking at the traffic cameras on the interstate. The highway patrol is clearing all lanes. There's a military convoy blowing through the toll booths at 90 miles an hour, and they're headed straight for Pine Ridge. Brad, did you arrest someone? Did you pick up somebody important?" Norton glanced at Rust, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. He looked in the rearview mirror at Albert. Albert hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. But for the first time, a faint, razor-thin smile touched the corners of the quiet man's lips. Before Norton could press the mic to respond, a low, pulsating vibration began to rattle the coffee cups in the cup holders. It wasn't the engine of the cruiser. It felt like an earthquake, a deep, rhythmic thumping that seemed to shake the very asphalt beneath their tires. "What the hell is that?" Rust asked, looking wildly out the window. The thumping grew louder, transforming into a deafening, mechanical roar. The sunlight streaming through the windshield suddenly vanished, swallowed by massive, rapid-moving shadows. Norton hit the brakes, throwing the cruiser into a skid as he instinctively looked up through the windshield. Flying scarcely 200 feet above the tree line, moving with terrifying speed and precision, were 2 massive CV-22 Osprey tiltrotor aircraft. Their massive dual rotors chewed through the air, deafening the small town as they banked hard, circling directly over the police cruiser like birds of prey locking onto a target. "Jesus Christ," Rust whispered, his face draining of all color. The radio erupted into a wall of static, followed by a voice that bypassed the local dispatch entirely. It was a military frequency overriding their municipal band, booming through the cruiser's speakers with terrifying authority. "Pine Ridge Police Unit 4. This is United States Marine Corps Airborne Element Actual. Pull your vehicle over to the shoulder immediately, turn off the engine, and place your hands outside the windows. If you deviate from these instructions, you will be considered a hostile threat and dealt with accordingly. Do it now." Dust and gravel whipped into a blinding cyclone as the 2 massive CV-22 Ospreys pivoted their nacelles, transitioning from forward flight to a vertical hover. The deafening, rhythmic thud of the rotors battered the roof of the Pine Ridge police cruiser, vibrating the floorboards so violently that Officer Kevin Rust dropped his sidearm onto the floor mats. Outside, the Georgia pine trees bowed under the immense hurricane-force downwash. "Brad, what do we do?" Rust screamed over the mechanical roar, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal of pure terror. He pressed his hands against the glass, watching the sheer scale of the military hardware descending upon their tiny stretch of highway. Officer Bradley Norton couldn't answer. His hands were frozen on the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his mouth hanging open in a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. The arrogant swagger that had defined him 10 minutes ago in the diner had evaporated, replaced by the primal, paralyzing fear of a bully who suddenly realizes he has cornered a lion. The first Osprey touched down squarely in the center of Highway 9, its landing gear absorbing the immense weight with a hydraulic hiss. Before the wheels had even settled, the rear ramp dropped open. A squad of heavily armed United States Marines poured out into the dust storm. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying fluidity. No shouting, no hesitation, just flawless tactical execution. They were clad in Cry-Precision combat uniforms, heavy plate carriers, and advanced ballistic helmets equipped with panoramic night vision goggles flipped up. Every man carried an M4A1 carbine, the laser sights cutting sharp, emerald lines through the swirling dirt, all converging directly on the windshield of Unit 4. Simultaneously, the ground shook again. Tearing around the bend of the highway came a convoy of 4 Oshkosh Joint Light Tactical Vehicles, JLTVAs, their massive armored hulls painted in desert tan. They didn't slow down for the shoulder. They smashed through the aluminum guardrails, cutting off the cruiser's front and rear escape routes. The heavy turrets mounted on top of the vehicles whirred mechanically, tracking the police car. "Hands out the window! Do it now!" Rust sobbed, frantically rolling down his window and shoving his trembling arms into the blistering heat. "Brad, roll down the window!" Norton fumbled with the master switch, his thick fingers slipping. The windows buzzed down. He thrust his hands out, his palms sweating, his eyes darting frantically from the laser dots painting his chest to the heavily armored men surrounding his vehicle. A squad leader, a towering Marine captain wearing a name tape that read Stanton, stepped into the gap between the cruiser and the lead JLTV. He didn't unholster his Sig Sauer M17 sidearm. He simply rested his hand on his rifle sling, projecting an aura of absolute, lethal authority. "Driver and passenger, use your outside hand to unbuckle your seatbelts. Open the doors from the outside. Step out slowly, facing away from the vehicle. Any sudden movements will be interpreted as a lethal threat," Captain Stanton ordered through a portable bullhorn. Norton swallowed hard, tasting battery acid in the back of his throat. He reached out, grabbed the door handle, and pushed it open. He stumbled out onto the asphalt, his knees buckling slightly under his own weight. Rust practically fell out of the passenger side, already weeping silently. As the 2 officers were ordered to their knees on the scorching pavement, a black armored SUV pulled up behind the JLTVs. The rear door opened, and Admiral Thomas Croft stepped out. Croft did not look like a man who was there to negotiate. He wore his utility uniform, the silver stars on his collar gleaming in the sun. His face was set in a rigid mask of cold fury. He walked past the kneeling, trembling police officers without so much as a glance, his eyes fixed entirely on the back seat of the cruiser. Stanton flanked the Admiral, signaling 2 Marines forward. "Secure the vehicle. Extract the package." The Marines moved to the rear door. One of them peered through the tinted glass. "Target acquired. He's restrained, sir." "Get him out!" Croft barked. The Marine yanked the door handle. It was locked from the front console. Without a second's hesitation, the Marine drew a heavy tactical glass breaker, smashed the rear window into a shower of safety cubes, reached inside, and unlocked the door. They pulled the door open. Inside, sitting amid the shattered glass and the stifling heat, Albert Peterson remained perfectly still. His hands were securely ratcheted behind his back, his wrists bruised and swelling from the tight steel. He looked up at Admiral Croft, and for the first time that day, his expression softened. "Afternoon, Tommy," Albert said quietly, his deep voice cutting through the fading whine of the Osprey engines. "Good to see you, Art," Croft replied, signaling the Marines to step back. "Though I've got to admit, your taste in local dining is getting worse." "Hey!" Norton suddenly yelled from the ground, finding a momentary, idiotic burst of courage born of sheer confusion. "You can't do this! You are interfering with a lawful arrest. We are local law enforcement. This is our jurisdiction. That man assaulted a police officer." Admiral Croft slowly turned his head. He looked at Norton the way a boot looks at an ant. "Captain Stanton," Croft said, his voice dangerously low. "Sir." "Relieve these men of their duty belts. Then bring that one to me." "Yes, sir," Stanton signaled. Two Marines descended upon Norton and Rust, violently stripping them of their weapons, tasers, radios, and handcuffs. Norton was hauled to his feet by the back of his collar and dragged over to where Croft stood beside the cruiser. "You want to talk about jurisdiction, officer?" Croft asked, stepping into Norton's personal space. The Admiral radiated an intense, focused aggression that made Norton shrink back. "You have illegally detained a Level 7 national security asset. You have violated Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. And frankly, I don't give a damn about your municipal badge. Right now, you are a hostile combatant, interfering with a federal military operation." He was resisting?" Norton stammered, sweat pouring down his red face. "He refused to identify himself. He made threats." Albert slowly shifted in the back seat, swinging his legs out of the cruiser. "Admiral, if you wouldn't mind?" he asked, nodding toward his bound hands. Croft gestured to Stanton. The captain pulled a set of heavy bolt cutters from his tactical rig. He didn't bother asking for the keys. He positioned the heavy steel jaws over the chain of the handcuffs and clamped down. With a sharp crack, the chain snapped. Albert brought his hands forward, massaging his bruised wrists, his face impassive. "Resisting," Albert repeated the word, tasting it, looking at Norton. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up. "My vitals are recorded and transmitted directly to the L3 Harris Secure Server in real time. Heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol levels. They will show I remained entirely docile. The diner's security cameras, which my associates at the NSA secured via a remote back door 10 minutes ago, will show I complied with every command. Your own body cameras will seal your fate." Norton's face went entirely pale. The realization of what he had done was finally piercing through his thick skull. This wasn't just a lawyer or a rich tourist. This was a ghost, a weapon. "Why?" Rust whimpered from his knees, looking at Albert. "If you're so important, why didn't you just show us the military ID? Why didn't you just tell us?" Albert stopped rubbing his wrists. The calm, detached demeanor he had maintained all afternoon vanished, replaced by a cold, righteous anger that seemed to drop the temperature around him. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Rust and Norton. "Because if I had flashed my clearance, you would have backed down," Albert said, his baritone voice echoing off the armored hulls of the JLTVs. "You would have apologized, called me sir, and let me walk away. And then, tomorrow, you would have gone right back to preying on the people who don't have a direct line to the Pentagon." Admiral Croft crossed his arms, watching Albert. He knew his old friend well enough to know there was always a mission. Albert never did anything by accident. 3 months ago, Albert continued, his eyes drilling into Norton's soul, a woman named Sarah Collins was driving through this county. Her husband, Staff Sergeant Daniel Collins, died serving under my command in Fallujah. She was passing through Pine Ridge with the life insurance payout, heading to Florida to start over with her 2 kids. Norton's breath hitched. He remembered the woman. He remembered the out-of-state plates. He remembered pulling her over for a broken tail light that wasn't broken. "You pulled her over," Albert said, stepping closer until he was inches from Norton's terrified face. "You claimed you smelled narcotics. You tore her car apart, found the cash, and seized it under civil asset forfeiture. $75,000. You took a grieving widow's future, handed her a receipt, and told her if she fought it, you'd call Child Protective Services and take her kids." A heavy silence fell over the highway. The Marines standing guard gripped their rifles tighter, their expressions hardening with disgust. Admiral Croft's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. "She called the state authorities. She called lawyers," Albert said, his voice a lethal whisper. "But Pine Ridge has a notoriously corrupt judge, and your department protects its own. She was stonewalled, broken. She called me last week, ready to end her own life." Albert turned back to look at the diner in the distance, then back to the 2 trembling cops. "I couldn't just send a federal prosecutor down here. They need a bulletproof case. They need an undeniable civil rights violation that crosses federal lines to trigger an immediate, overwhelming DOJ intervention," Albert explained, looking at the blinking infrared light on his watch. "I needed you to assault a federal asset. I needed you to kidnap me." The twist hit Norton like a physical blow. The quiet man in the booth hadn't been a random victim. He was the bait, and Norton had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. "You set us up," Norton breathed, his legs finally giving out as he collapsed onto the asphalt. "No, Bradley," Albert corrected softly. "I just sat down and ordered coffee. Your own arrogance set you up." The sound of wailing sirens pierced the air, approaching from the south. But these weren't local police cruisers. A convoy of black, unmarked Dodge Chargers and Chevrolet Tahoes came tearing up the shoulder, their blue and red grille lights flashing frantically. They screeched to a halt behind the military perimeter. Doors flew open, and a dozen men and women wearing tactical vests emblazoned with FBI and DOJ piled out. Leading them was a sharp-eyed federal prosecutor, flanked by heavily armed FBI SWAT agents. Admiral Croft stepped forward to meet them. "They're all yours, Director," as promised. The prosecutor nodded grimly, signaling his agents. They moved in on Norton and Rust, hauling them to their feet, aggressively securing their hands behind their backs with heavy plastic zip ties. "Bradley Norton and Kevin Rust," the lead FBI agent read from a laminated card, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to deprive civil rights, kidnapping of a federal contractor, and wire fraud. We have simultaneously executed search warrants on the Pine Ridge Police Department, your local magistrate's office, and your personal residences." It's over. As the federal agents dragged the sobbing, broken officers toward the transport vans, Albert turned back to the cruiser. He reached onto the hood, picked up his wallet, his keys, and his tactical watch, strapping it back onto his wrist. Croft put a heavy hand on Albert's shoulder. "You took a massive risk, Art. If they hadn't stopped at the diner, if they had taken you somewhere quiet and put a bullet in your head before you hit that distress signal, they were cowards, Tommy," Albert said quietly, watching the FBI vans load their prisoners. "Cowards always need an audience to feel strong. They were never going to take me somewhere quiet. They needed the diner to see them win." Albert looked at his bruised wrists, then up at the clear blue Georgia sky. "Sarah Collins is getting her money back, and Pine Ridge is getting a new police department, while officers Bradley Norton and Kevin Rust were being shoved into the back of armored federal transport vans on Highway 9. A much larger, highly coordinated tactical hammer was dropping on the rest of the town's corrupt infrastructure. The FBI's Atlanta field office had been quietly building a shadow dossier on the Pine Ridge Police Department for over a year. They knew about the missing evidence, the fabricated warrants, and the predatory civil asset forfeitures, but they had lacked the single, unimpeachable catalyst required to tear down an entire municipal government without sparking a drawn-out, politically messy state rights battle. Albert Peterson had given them a federal kidnapping charge involving a Tier 1 military intelligence contractor. In the eyes of the United States Department of Justice, Pine Ridge had just declared war on the federal government. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and merciless. 5 miles away from the highway standoff, Police Chief Garrison Wallace sat in his expansive, wood-paneled office at the Pine Ridge precinct. Wallace was a man who wore his authority like a heavy crown, a thick-necked, cigar-chewing relic of a bygone era, who treated the county lines as the borders of his own sovereign nation. He was currently reviewing the department's quarterly forfeiture ledger, calculating how much of the seized illicit funds could be diverted to purchase new luxury cruisers for his senior staff. He never even heard the approach of the 3 matte black Lenco Bearcat armored vehicles. At exactly 2:45 p.m., the front glass doors of the Pine Ridge Police Department shattered inward, blown off their hinges by a synchronized explosive breaching charge. The lobby, usually occupied by a single bored desk sergeant, instantly filled with suffocating white smoke and the blinding strobe of tactical flashlights. 24 FBI special weapons and tactics agents poured through the breach. They moved with a terrifying, mechanized efficiency, completely overrunning the local officers before anyone could even unholster a sidearm. FBI! Federal warrant! Hands in the air! Do not touch your weapons! The commanding voice of Special Agent in Charge, Daniel Harper, boomed through the precinct, amplified by a heavy bullhorn. In his office, Chief Wallace vaulted out of his leather chair, dropping his cigar onto the carpet. He instinctively reached for the heavy Colt .45 resting on his desk, his face twisting in outrage. "What in the hell?" Wallace began to roar, charging toward his closed office door. Before his hand could touch the brass knob, the door exploded inward. A heavy steel battering ram, wielded by 2 towering federal agents, pulverized the heavy oak frame. The door slammed into Wallace, throwing the massive man backward over his own desk. He crashed to the floor in a shower of scattered files, overturned coffee, and splintered wood. Before Wallace could draw a breath, 3 laser sights painted his chest. Heavy combat boots pinned his wrists to the carpet. "Chief Garrison Wallace," Agent Harper barked, stepping into the ruined office, his badge gleaming against his heavy tactical vest. "Do not move a muscle." "Are you out of your mind?" Wallace sputtered, spitting blood from a busted lip as he struggled helplessly against the agents pinning him down. "I am the Chief of Police. You have no jurisdiction here. I'll have your badges for this." "You don't have the authority to write a parking ticket anymore, Garrison," Harper replied coldly. He pulled a thick sheaf of legal documents from his vest and tossed them onto Wallace's chest. "Federal indictments under the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You and your department are being charged as an ongoing criminal enterprise. Conspiracy, wire fraud, extortion, and civil rights violations under Title 18, Section 242. Wallace's eyes darted frantically around the room, the reality of the situation finally penetrating his arrogant facade. Federal agents were already systematically tearing his office apart. They were ripping the hard drives out of his computers, seizing his private ledgers, and boxing up the illegal, untraceable cash he kept in a false-bottomed filing cabinet. "This is about the Collins woman, isn't it?" Wallace hissed, a look of desperate venom crossing his face as cold steel cuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. "That money was legally seized. You can't prove a damn thing." "We didn't need to." A deep, resonant voice echoed from the shattered doorway. Wallace craned his neck upward. Standing amid the smoke and the wreckage of the precinct was Albert Peterson. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming man in the faded Henley. He wore a tailored dark suit that hid the lethal mechanics of his physique, his posture radiating absolute authority. Beside him stood Admiral Thomas Croft, flanked by 2 heavily armed Marine sentries. "We just needed you to make a mistake," Albert said quietly, walking slowly into the office. "And you sent 2 of your most arrogant, untrained thugs to kidnap a man carrying a Class A federal security clearance." Wallace's face drained of color. He looked from Albert to the Admiral, then down at the federal indictments resting on his chest. The trap had been flawlessly executed. There would be no local judge to dismiss the charges, no county prosecutor to conveniently lose the paperwork. They were going to federal prison. "Your evidence locker is being emptied by federal auditors," Albert continued, his voice a low, emotionless drone that cut through Wallace more sharply than any shout. "Your personal bank accounts, and those of every corrupt officer in this building, have already been frozen by the Department of the Treasury. Ironically, Chief, we used the exact same civil asset forfeiture laws you weaponized against innocent citizens. Only this time, it's entirely legal." At the county courthouse, 3 blocks away, a similar scene was unfolding. Judge Clayton Reed, the architect of the legal shield that had protected Wallace's criminal enterprise, was pulled from his chambers in the middle of a hearing. FBI agents escorted the screaming, red-faced magistrate through the crowded courthouse lobby in handcuffs, permanently ending a decades-long reign of judicial terror. By sundown, the Pine Ridge Police Department ceased to exist. Every officer implicated in the extortion ring was in federal custody. The state police had been called in to temporarily manage emergency services. The town, which had lived under a cloud of fear and intimidation for years, watched in stunned silence as a convoy of federal transport buses carried their tormentors away in chains. Albert stood in the parking lot of the precinct, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the hood of his truck. He watched the last FBI Bearcat roll out of town. Admiral Croft walked up beside him, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. "Clean sweep, Art. The DOJ is ecstatic. They've been trying to crack this county for 3 years. You handed it to them in 3 hours. It shouldn't require a military distress beacon to hold bad men accountable, Tommy," Albert said softly, taking the coffee. His eyes were tired, the adrenaline finally fading from his system. "The system is broken when it takes a ghost to save the living." "Maybe," Croft agreed, looking out at the darkened town. "But today, the ghost did his job. What's your next move, Vanguard?" Albert took a sip of the bitter coffee, his gaze shifting to the southern horizon. "I have a delivery to make." 3 days later, the oppressive heat of Georgia was replaced by the humid, salty breeze of the Florida coastline. Sarah Collins stood in the cramped kitchen of a rundown duplex in Pensacola. She was exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights, of a grief that was entirely consuming, compounded by the crushing weight of financial ruin. She was packing dishes into a cardboard box. Without the $75,000 life insurance payout her late husband had left her, the money that had been stolen by Norton and Rust, she could no longer afford the rent. She was preparing to move her 2 young children into a subsidized apartment complex across town. A sharp, firm knock at the front door made her jump. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, her heart rate accelerating. Ever since the incident in Pine Ridge, she lived in a constant state of low-level panic, terrified that the corrupt police force would follow through on their threats to take her children. She approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. Standing on the porch was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a neat, casual suit. He held a thick manila folder in his hands. He didn't look like a police officer, and he didn't look like a bill collector. He looked remarkably calm. Sarah opened the door, leaving the chain engaged. "Can I help you, Sarah Collins?" the man asked. His voice was incredibly deep, yet gentle. "Yes, who are you?" "My name is Albert Peterson," he said, holding his hands in plain view so she could see he meant no harm. I served with Daniel in Al-Anbar and later in Fallujah. He was one of the finest recon scouts I ever had the privilege of commanding. Sarah's breath hitched. She unlocked the chain and slowly opened the door. The mention of Daniel's name, spoken with such reverence by a fellow soldier, immediately broke down her defensive walls. "You knew my husband?" "I did," Albert said, a warm, sad smile touching his lips. "He spoke of you and the kids, constantly. He was a good man, Sarah, and he deserved better than what this country has put you through." Albert extended the manila folder toward her. "May I come in for a moment? I have some things that belong to you." Sarah stepped aside, allowing him into the small living room. Albert didn't judge the packed boxes or the worn furniture. He stood respectfully by the coffee table, waiting for her to sit down before he did. "I don't understand," Sarah said, clutching her hands in her lap. "The military already sent all of Daniel's personal effects. The funeral was 6 months ago. This isn't from the military, Sarah. This is from the Department of Justice," Albert explained. He opened the folder. He pulled out a cashier's check issued directly from the United States Treasury. He placed it gently on the table and slid it toward her. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes widening as she read the numbers printed on the crisp paper. It was for $150,000. I don't," she stammered, tears instantly pooling in her eyes. "Daniel's policy was only for $75,000. What is this?" "The first 75 is the money that was illegally seized from you in Pine Ridge," Albert said softly. "The DOJ recovered the exact funds from Chief Wallace's private accounts. The second 75,000 is a restitution payment from the Federal Victims' Compensation Fund, paid out directly from the liquidated assets of the officers who terrorized you. They will be spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, a choked sob escaping her throat. The crushing, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on her chest for 3 months suddenly vanished. It was over. The nightmare was over. "How?" she whispered, looking up at Albert through her tears. "I called everyone. I begged for help. Nobody would listen to me. Sometimes the official channels get clogged with bureaucracy," Albert replied, his dark eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. "And sometimes it just takes the right person sitting in the wrong diner to clear the blockage." He reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a heavy, dark blue velvet box bearing the gold seal of the United States Marine Corps. He opened it, revealing a pristine, gleaming Silver Star medal resting on a bed of white satin. "The Pentagon bureaucracy is slow, Sarah," Albert said, his voice thick with emotion. "But Daniel earned this on his final deployment. The paperwork finally cleared. Admiral Croft wanted me to deliver it to you personally." Sarah reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the edges of the medal. The tears flowed freely now, a mixture of profound grief and overwhelming relief. "Thank you," she wept, looking at Albert. "I don't know who you really are, Albert, but thank you for not forgetting us. We never leave our own behind, Sarah," Albert said gently. "Never." He stood up, quietly excusing himself while she held the medal to her chest. He let himself out the front door, stepping back into the warm Florida sunshine. Albert walked down the driveway to his parked Silverado. He climbed into the cab, the leather seat creaking familiarly under his weight. He didn't turn the key immediately. He sat in the quiet cabin, looking at the heavy tactical watch on his wrist. The infrared beacon was silent. The connection to the exosphere satellite was dormant. For the first time in a long time, the ledger felt balanced. Albert put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb, heading west. There were still a lot of roads left to travel, and the world was full of men who thought they were untouchable. But as long as Vanguard Actual was breathing, there would always be a reckoning waiting in the shadows. We hope you enjoyed this thrilling dive into the dark corners of corruption and the explosive delivery of true justice. The story of Albert Peterson proves that true power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to act when the time is right. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with your friends who love military justice and tactical revenge stories.